While this does vary from Navy to Navy, naming warships for previous warships is a fairly common practice. This could be a direct callback to a famous predecessor or simply a reuse of a noteworthy name. A prominent example of the former came with the Second World War, where multiple American warships took on names of predecessors sunk in combat. That said, you don't often see a ship named for a nickname of a previous warship. One particular ship, however, would buck the trend. The Civil War era ironclad USS New Ironsides. This ironclad was named in honor of the far more famous USS Constitution, which, among other things, was nicknamed Old Ironsides for her duel with Guerriere. Since Constitution was still in limited service, that name was not free. But at the same time, if you were building an experimental ironclad, Ironsides was a good substitute. Thus, Old Ironsides became New Ironsides. Admittedly, the name would prove to be well earned. New Ironsides was quite a tank by the standards of her day, a conservative design in comparison to USS Monitor, but one that shrugged off Confederate gunfire at multiple different engagements. Unfortunately, that armor couldn't save her. New Ironsides would only have about 2 years of active service, largely due to just how late in the grand scheme of things she entered service, as well as a devastating fire in reserve that sent the ship to the bottom. Still, even if New Ironsides didn't pave any paths forward, she gave good service, and I find the ship to be an interesting one, so often overshadowed by the swarm of monitors, despite the fact that, for the majority of Civil War blockade duty, New Ironsides was superior, especially shore bombardment. So in today's video, we'll focus on New Ironsides, from her design to the short but successful service she rendered, starting in this case with where the ship originated. This came when the United States government started getting reports of Confederate ironclad construction, specifically the conversion of the burnt-out Merrimack into CSS Virginia. This prompted a bit of a panic as the Navy, in particular, was well aware of the danger to the naval blockade. As a result, Congress approved funding on August 3, 1861, to build ironclads, to the tune of $1.5 million. This would result in 17 designs from various shipbuilders, but of those, only 3 would be recommended on September 16, 1861. A spread from innovative to conservative in their design approach. The Navy was hedging its bets in the event one or more of the designs proved to be problematic, which is why most of the rejected options were, well, rejected. They were problematic to some extent or another, either from lack of detail or questionable design choices. Take, for example, William Kingsley putting forth a rubber-clad, a ship literally armored with rubber with the intention of shells bouncing off the side. Anyway, that detour aside, let's touch on the 3 winning options. The most innovative of the designs, of course, was USS Monitor, with its revolving turret and incredibly limited freeboard and draft, while the middle child, as it were, was USS Galena, a wooden-hulled ship with armor made from interlocked iron rails, which proved to be less effective than hoped, and Galena is largely forgotten as a result. The third design, meanwhile, was USS New Ironsides, in many respects the most conservative of the bunch, a wooden-hulled broadside ironclad similar in concept to the French Glory. This was still a major leap forward for the United States Navy, of course, their first proper sea-going ironclad warship. In any event, this design was submitted by the company Merrick and Sons, well known for building steam engines, but not so much warships. As a result, the ones building the design would be William Cramp. Now, with that establishing the background, what was the design they built? Well, the first thing to note is another of the requirements the Navy put forward. All three ships needed to have very shallow drafts, specifically for their blockade duty. The southern states had a lot of shallow bays and rivers, which were difficult, if not impossible, to cover with traditional warships. For New Ironsides, this meant a very beamy ship with a flat-bottomed hull. The ship was 249 feet, 76 meters long, with a beam of 57 feet 6 inches, or 17.5 meters. To quote the old steam Navy, that resulted in a length-to-beam ratio of 1:4. For comparison, a more typical steam frigate was 38 feet on the beam. The combination of that chunky hull and the flat bottom resulted in a draft of just under 16 feet. To be specific, 15 feet 8 inches, or 4.8 meters. USS Merrimack, the ship that became CSS Virginia, had a draft of 24 feet, 7.3 meters for reference. When all was said and done, that hull form resulted in a displacement of around 4,120 tons. This made her far and away the heaviest of the three accepted designs. With good reason, as that displacement went to both armor and firepower. Let's start with the armor. At the waterline, the ship had a 4.5-inch, 114mm thick belt. This ran the entire length of the ship, though it thinned down to 3 inches, 76mm below the waterline. The ship also had side armor of 4.5 inches in thickness, though this only covered the 170-foot, 51.8 meter long battery. The bow and stern were unprotected outside of the waterline belt. New Ironsides also had early transverse bulkhead armor. This sealed off the citadel with 2.5 inches of iron and a full foot of oak. This armor would prove quite useful in her service, as would the firepower, which was the main selling point compared to a monitor. This was originally going to be 16 9-inch, 229mm Dahlgren guns. The Navy didn't care for their performance at Hampton Roads, however, so those were subbed out. While under construction, New Ironsides was adapted to take 14 11-inch, 279mm guns instead. Weaponry was rounded off with two 5.1-inch, 130mm, 50-pound rifled guns for chase gun duty. Those were later replaced by 60-pound guns in 1864. And that was the firepower. However, New Ironsides also featured an iron ram in the bow, although this feature was a tad optimistic due to the sluggish speed. The ship was intended to reach 9 to 10 knots. In practice, she struggled to make 6 knots, even with the rigging deployed. Part of this was her engine, intended for 1800 indicated horsepower, not being useful at full power. The ship was difficult to steer at high speed, most likely due to the design of the hull, though at the time the rudder was blamed. An interesting design, with a second rudder attached to the aft end of the first. Regardless, it meant New Ironsides was slow and difficult to steer. Not a huge issue for blockade duty, but certainly a problem if she had to engage ships. As we'll see, now that the design section is finished, this wouldn't really happen. Her service was extensive, but she wouldn't engage another ironclad. That aside, the story of New Ironsides as a ship began on October 15th, 1861. Merrick was awarded the contract for delivery in 9 months with a $500 penalty for each day past July 15th, 1862. A bit harsh, perhaps, but the Navy really wanted the ship as soon as possible. As it would turn out, New Ironsides was launched on May 10th, 1862, and commissioned on August 21st. A bit behind schedule, but the Navy elected not to charge the penalty fee, probably because of the fact they requested so many design changes. In fact, Merrick was paid around $34,000 extra due to all those changes. For example, the bulkheads. Unfortunately for the builder, their ship wasn't quite ready for combat action. During her first voyage, a couple issues would crop up. For instance, the speed and steering problems I mentioned earlier. However, there was also a third issue. The ship's guns used an innovative recoil carriage due to being larger than the original design called for. In simple terms, it saw the guns fitted in an iron cradle that ran on iron rails. This proved to be too slippery, for lack of a better word. The clamps couldn't handle the recoil. This was only solved in December 1862 by putting pieces of wood beneath the clamps in order to increase friction. This was the kind of issue normally identified on sea trials. However, New Ironsides wouldn't have sea trials in the strictest sense. Admiral Goldsborough, commanding the blockade at Hampton Roads, had been pressing the Navy for the ship since July 1862. He was concerned about Confederate ironclads and wanted the untested ship, and he wanted her yesterday. New Ironsides would, as a result, sail to Hampton Roads on August 22, 1862. She would arrive there on August 26th, only to leave on the 31st as the panic wore off. This would allow the ship to go into refit to try and address the various problems. Unfortunately, they wouldn't fully be solved before the ship returned to Hampton Roads on September 23, 1862. In fact, the speed and steering problems would never be completely sorted. While the gun carriages had that wooden strip fixed while the ship was anchored off of Hampton Roads, a place she remained until January 11th of 1863. At this point, the ironclad was sent to Port Royal, South Carolina. New Ironsides arrived on January 18th, where the ship had her masts removed and her funnel toyed with. The masts were removed because they were just a target close in to shore. Instead, signal poles were put in place. As for the stack, this was cut down to try and clear the view from the pilot house. This had been fitted in a location where it was impossible to see directly ahead. Alas, all that cutting down the stack did was create a lot of smoke. So it was restored, and the crew had to put up with the lack of visibility. While this work was ongoing, the Confederates made an attempt to break Charleston's blockade on January 31st. This saw two ironclads, Palmetto State and Chicora, engage the Union forces. They temporarily captured two ships, but both Union warships would escape. Nonetheless, New Ironsides was rushed to Charleston, where she anchored on February 1st, only to leave on February 6th as the rudder broke loose during her blockade duty. This was fixed at Port Royal, with the ship back at Charleston on February 10th, 1863. She would remain there through April, an imposing roadblock to Confederate ambitions. They refused to send their smaller ironclads out, aware they stood no chance against New Ironsides. That said, things would change in April. During the first week, a group of monitors were assembled off Charleston, joined by New Ironsides and the experimental Keokuk. A total of 9 ironclads, 7 monitors, plus the 2 bigger ones. On April 7, 1863, this formation bombarded Fort Sumter. Unfortunately for the Union, this would be a costly failure. Keokuk would sink from damage sustained in the battle, and several monitors took varying degrees of damage. New Ironsides, for her part, struggled. Over the course of 2 hours, the ship had to anchor twice to avoid running aground. The monitors Catskill and Nantucket both collided with her as they tried to move past. And at one point, New Ironsides moored directly over a mine that luckily failed to detonate. The ship fired only one broadside of her own because of these issues. On the other hand, the 50 or so hits she took did no real damage. New Ironsides was thus able to remain on station to reinforce the blockade when the monitors left for repair. She would remain in that position until July, when offensive operations resumed. New Ironsides quickly became an invaluable asset for shore bombardment. Her stout sides and heavy broadside made her uniquely suited to this role. For 2 months, New Ironsides bombarded Confederate forts, sometimes as close as 1,000 yards, with her armor shrugging off return fire. It reached the point the Confederates considered her the single largest threat off of Charleston. 2 attempts were made by spar torpedo boat to sink the ship. The first, on August 21, 1863, was a failure. The Confederate boat's engine failed, and she was lucky to escape under fire. Soon after, on September 6th, the combination of fire from New Ironsides and an Army siege prompted the Confederates to evacuate Fort Wagner. While on September 7th, USS Weehawken ran aground, attacking Fort Sumter. New Ironsides would place herself between the Monitor and Fort Moultrie, firing 483 shells of her own, while taking at least 70 hits in return. Soon after, on September 8th, she provided Marines to try and seize Fort Sumter. A failure in the end. What wasn't a failure was her service. New Ironsides would fire nearly 4,500 rounds between July and October 1863, and was hit in return by at least 150. Despite this, she went largely undamaged, proving her armor's strength. Even a second spar torpedo attack on October 5th failed to do appreciable damage. The ship was hit by CSS David, but the damage was largely superficial. It really speaks to the stoutness of New Ironsides. The ship was only sent off for a refit in May 1864 after 15 months of straight service. An enviable record no matter how you slice it. As for this refit, it ran from June 3rd to August 27th of 1864, with the next combat action coming on Christmas Eve when New Ironsides joined an assault on Fort Fisher. This fort protected Wilmington, North Carolina. Soon after New Ironsides opened fire, the fort was temporarily silenced. The attack on Christmas Day failed, while New Ironsides continued her bombardment, even after the rudder broke free and had to be reinforced with a chain. After this, there was a break into the new year, with New Ironsides returning to the attack on January 13th, 1865, once more closing to within 1,000 yards before opening fire on Fort Fisher, with the fort ultimately falling on January 15th, 1865. It would be the last notable action for New Ironsides. She would spend the rest of the war supporting operations on the James River before decommissioning on April 6, 1865, where she would remain in reserve until being destroyed by a fire on December 16, 1866. A sad end to a veteran warship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.